The candle in her hand trembled before she did. One wrong door, one forbidden floor. In November of 1817, at Ashfern Hall in Northumberland, a housemaid named Eleanor Hart knelt before cold grates at 5 in the morning, 4 hidden verses folded inside the pocket of her gray wool apron. Mrs. Whitlock, the governess, recited the rule each dawn like a prayer. The east wing, the Earl's apartments, were forbidden to her. Eleanor lowered her eyes and obeyed. She had been a servant for 7 months. She had learned to be invisible. Above her lived Julian Ashcroft, Earl of Ashfern, 32. Pale, narrow at the mouth, a thin scar splitting his right brow. He passed her in corridors without seeing her, his signet ring catching the lamplight, his boots silent on the runner, or so she believed. Then the storm came. At 10 in the evening, a bolt of lightning killed the gas, and Eleanor, candlestick in hand, climbed the wrong staircase. She pushed open a heavy oak door and found the Earl standing barefoot before the fire, his linen shirt open at the throat, his black hair fallen across his forehead. "Wrong room, Milord," she whispered, and stepped back. He crossed the room in 4 strides, the bronze key turned in the lock behind her. What he said next, against the oak at her shoulder, would unmake every rule she had ever obeyed. Before the story begins, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of justice, dignity, and love that arrives against all odds move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a member and help our channel. The year was 1817, and Ashfern Hall slept the cold sleep of great houses in late November. Eleanor Hart knelt before the long-room hearth at 5 in the morning, scraping ash from the iron grate into a tin pail, and her breath made small ghosts above the cold bricks. The fire had been dead since midnight. She had banked it herself before going up to the attic at 11, and now she was the one who must coax it back. That was the order of things in this house. The girl who buried the embers was the same girl who woke them. She worked quickly, kindling first, laid in a neat lattice across the bed of ash, then the smaller coals from the scuttle, arranged with the patience of someone who had learned that a careless fire wasted both heat and time. A long match, drawn down from the chimney shelf, the strike, the blue flare, the wood took, and a thin yellow blade of light climbed the inside of the chimney, and Eleanor leaned back on her heels and let her shoulders fall, just once, in the dark. 7 months she had worn this gray wool gown. She knew its hem by touch now, the small mended place at the back where she had caught it on a nail in the scullery in her 2nd week, the spot at the cuff where Lye had bleached the dye to almost nothing. The starched white apron over it was newer, replaced each Sunday by Mrs. Whitlock herself, because an apron that was not perfectly white was, in Mrs. Whitlock's view, a wound to the honor of the house. The white cotton cap sat low across Eleanor's forehead. Her dark brown hair, almost black, was twisted into a knot so tight at the nape that her scalp ached by mid-afternoon. She had stopped noticing the ache around the 4th month. She stood. 6 fireplaces remained on the ground floor before the family rose, and she had perhaps an hour. Her small calloused hand closed around the handle of the coal scuttle, and the iron key at her waist clinked once against the buckle of her belt. The sound was almost the only sound in the house. In the inner pocket of her apron, pressed flat against her ribs, were 4 folded verses copied in her own narrow hand. She did not need to look at them. She knew where they sat. They sat above her heart like a small, warm coin. She moved into the long corridor, and the candle in her free hand threw her shadow tall and thin along the paneled wall. Ashfern Hall had grown quietly poor in the last 20 years. The great Aubusson runner in this passage was worn pale down its center. The silver wall sconces had been replaced one by one with cheaper brass, and 3 of the marble busts that had once stood on plinths between the doors were gone, sold off to a dealer in York. What remained, however, remained beautiful. The plasterwork above her head still showed acanthus leaves curling toward a central rosette, and the high windows at the far end of the passage caught the first gray of dawn and gave it back as something pearl. She did not let herself look at the plasterwork for long. The girl who looked up too often was the girl who tripped over a footstool and broke a Wedgwood saucer and lost 2 weeks of wages. In the small breakfast parlor, she knelt again, swept, laid, struck. The fire took on the first try. In the morning room she did the same. In the long library, with its smell of old leather and beeswax and damp paper, She paused for the smallest part of a second before the lowest shelf on the eastern wall, where a thin brown volume of Cowper had sat untouched for a year before she had begun to slip it into her apron on Sunday evenings and copy out 4 lines at a time by the kitchen candle and return it before dawn. She did not touch the book now. She lit the library fire and went on. By the time she reached the small study at the end of the west wing, the great clock on the upper landing had struck 6, and Mrs. Whitlock was waiting for her at the foot of the back stair. The housekeeper stood with her hands folded at her waist over the white starched apron, her 30 iron keys hanging from the leather belt, the black bombazine gown falling straight and severe to the toes of her sensible shoes. Her small brown eyes behind the half-moon spectacles took in the smudge on Eleanor's cuff and the loose strand of dark hair at her temple in one short pass, and her thin mouth tightened in the way it tightened when she was choosing not to scold. Heart. Mrs. Whitlock. Tuck the hair. Eleanor's fingers went up, found the strand, tucked it. The cuff you may wash at noon. Stand straight, child. A maid who stoops at 20, stoops at 60. Yes, Mrs. Whitlock. The housekeeper let a pause sit between them, neither short nor long, only weighed. You will recall the rule. I will, Mrs. Whitlock. Recite it. Eleanor lifted her chin a fraction. Her voice was low and very even. The east wing is the private wing of his lordship. No female servant of this house sets foot above the landing of the east stair, by day or by night, for any purpose, save by direct summons of his lordship or of yourself. The rule has no exception. The rule has no excuse. Good. Mrs. Whitlock's hands did not unfold. And the punishment. Dismissal without character. Dismissal without character, the housekeeper repeated, as though to settle the words in the air between them like a small heavy stone. There are girls in the village who would scrub stone for half what you are paid, Hart, and I have a list of them in my desk. Do not put yourself upon that list. No, Mrs. Whitlock. The older woman's eyes softened by perhaps the width of a hair. She had taken Eleanor in 7 months ago on the word of the parish, a thin 22-year-old vicar's daughter with a dead father, a dead mother, and a brother who had drunk the parsonage out from under her. Mrs. Whitlock did not approve of pity. She had hired Eleanor anyway. She was not a woman who explained her reasons. To the breakfast room, she said. Lay for 1. His lordship rides at 8. Yes, Mrs. Whitlock. Eleanor curtsied, a small even dip of the knee, and went. In the breakfast room she laid 1 place at the head of the long mahogany table, because in this house there was only ever 1 place. A linen napkin folded into a precise rectangle, a single silver fork, a single silver knife, a single silver spoon, each polished the night before by the under-footman until they showed the small distorted face of whoever bent above them, a china plate of plain white with a thin band of blue at the rim, a single cup, a single saucer, the toast rack at the right hand, the pot of preserved gooseberry, opened and resealed, at the left. She stood back and looked at the table. The room was very large and very cold, and the table was very long, and at the far end of it the single-place setting looked, she thought, like a small white flag planted in a field of dark wood. She let herself think this for the space of 1 slow breath, and then she did not let herself think it any longer, because thoughts of that kind were a luxury, and she could not afford them, and they did not warm the room. She straightened the napkin by a 1/4 inch and went out. At 7 the great front bell rang, and from the window of the back stair she watched his lordship's chestnut hunter come around from the stable in the care of the head groom. The Earl of Ashfern appeared at the top of the steps almost at the same moment, drawing on his black leather gloves, his black wool coat buttoned high against the cold. She saw him only in profile and only for the space of 3 seconds. The long line of the jaw, the dark hair combed back from the brow, the thin pale scar that cut vertically through the right eyebrow, a small white line she had glimpsed once before across the length of the dining room and had never forgotten. He did not look toward the window. He never looked toward windows. He swung up into the saddle in 1 clean motion, gathered the reins, and was gone down the long drive between the bare lime trees before the bell had finished ringing the hour. Eleanor stepped back from the glass. She did not allow herself to follow him with her eyes. The girl who followed his lordship with her eyes was the girl who burned the toast and dropped the saucer and put herself on Mrs. Whitlock's list. She turned and went down the back stair to the kitchen, where cook had a copper pot of porridge waiting and a sharp word for any maid who came late to her own breakfast. The morning passed in the small, steady labors that filled all her mornings. She carried hot water in copper cans to the washstands of the 2 housemaids above her in rank. She turned the mattresses in the 3 guest rooms that had not held a guest in 9 years. She wiped the long mirror at the head of the main stair with a soft cloth and a little vinegar, and when she was finished, she did not look at her own face in it. At 11, Mrs. Whitlock summoned her to the linen room and set her to mending. The basket was high, a torn pillow slip, a frayed napkin, a nightshirt of fine linen, very long, with a small split at the cuff where a button had pulled through. Eleanor took up the nightshirt last and laid it across her lap, and her needle went into the cloth and out of the cloth in the small even stitches her mother had taught her at 7. It was while she was setting the 3rd stitch that she let her hand pause, just for a moment, and pressed her palm flat against the inside of her apron, where the 4 folded verses lay against her ribs. "Sometimes a light surprises," she said, almost without sound, "the Christian while he sings." It was the first line of one of the copied verses, and she said it not because she was thinking of God, but because she was thinking of how a thing said low and to oneself in a cold room could, for half a breath, warm the room. Then she took the next stitch and the next, and she did not say the second line aloud. At noon she ate bread and cheese standing at the kitchen window. At 1 she scrubbed the back stair with a brush and a bucket of gray water that smelled of soda. At 3 she carried up coal to the small drawing room because Mrs. Whitlock had decided, after consulting the barometer, that the air had a turn in it, and his lordship would want a fire before dinner. At 4 the sky beyond the long windows of the upper landing had gone the color of pewter. Eleanor paused there, the coal scuttle in her hand, and looked once at the row of bare lime trees down the drive, where the rooks were turning in slow circles against the low cloud, and she thought, without knowing she was thinking it, that a storm was coming in off the moor. She did not say so aloud. She went down the corridor to the small drawing room and laid the fire. When she came back along the upper landing, the housekeeper was waiting for her again, and this time, Mrs. Whitlock was holding a small slip of paper in her hand. "From his lordship's solicitor in London," she said, and her voice was carefully level. "Mr. Blackwood, he arrives Thursday. The blue chamber is to be aired. You will see to it." "Yes, Mrs. Whitlock." The housekeeper did not move. She held the slip of paper a moment longer between her thumb and her forefinger, looking at it as though it were a thing that smelled faintly wrong. Then she folded it once, and once again, and put it into the pocket at her waist. "Heart, Mrs. Whitlock, you will hear talk in the servants' hall this week. You will not repeat it. You will not, by look or by question, encourage it. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Mrs. Whitlock." "His lordship's affairs are his lordship's affairs." "Yes, Mrs. Whitlock." The housekeeper studied her a moment more, and what passed behind the half-moon spectacles was not unkindness, though it was not kindness either. It was a kind of weighing. Then she gave the smallest possible nod and turned and went down the back stair, and her keys went down with her in a small chiming descent. Eleanor stood alone on the upper landing. She did not need the warning. She had heard the half-sentences already. The kitchen knew, the stable knew. The girl who scoured pots had said, 2 nights ago, with the careful blankness of one repeating a thing she had been told never to repeat, that his lordship was to be married before Christmas to the daughter of the Duke of Holbrook, and the contract was for £80,000, and the bride's father did not mean to be kept waiting past the new year. Eleanor had heard this and had felt nothing she could put a name to. She had taken the pot off the girl and finished the scouring herself. That was all. Now, on the upper landing, with the pewter sky pressing close to the long windows and the rooks crying somewhere out beyond the bare trees, she let her hand go once again to the inside of her apron, where the 4 verses lay, and she pressed her palm flat against them, and she did not weep. She had not wept in 7 months. She did not mean to begin today. The clock on the upper landing struck the quarter. She bent, picked up the empty coal scuttle by its iron handle, and went down the back stair to the cellar to fill it again, because the fire in the small drawing room would burn down by 6, and his lordship, when he returned from his ride, would want it high. At the foot of the back stair she paused for the smallest part of a second, the scuttle in her hand, and lifted her face to the high, narrow window above the cellar door, where the first heavy drop of rain had just struck the glass and broken into 3 smaller drops that ran down the pane in slow, uneven lines. The storm was here. In the cellar, the cold was a different cold. It came up out of the flagstones through the thin soles of her black leather shoes and settled in the small bones of her ankles, and the single tallow candle she had left burning on the shelf above the coal heap through a yellow ring that did not reach the corners of the room. She set the scuttle down and took up the short iron shovel and began to fill it, one slow, careful stroke at a time, because the coal dust rose if you hurried and clung to the white apron and cost her another scolding. She worked. Above her head, very faintly, she heard the rain begin to drum in earnest against the iron-grated window at street level, and somewhere far away across the moor, a low roll of thunder moved across the sky and was gone. She did not raise her head. She counted the strokes of the shovel the way she had counted the stitches of the nightshirt, and the way she had counted the verses pressed flat against her ribs, and the way she had counted the 7 months since the parish cart had set her down at the gate of Ashfern Hall with one small carpet bag and a letter of character written in her dead father's careful hand. 7 months, 21 weeks of gray wool and starched linen and the iron key at her belt and the rule of the east wing recited each dawn at the foot of the back stair. She had not complained. She did not mean to begin tonight. There was, she had decided long ago, a dignity in the small even stitches of a life laid down stitch by stitch, and she would not let it be taken from her by a duke's daughter in white muslin, or by a contract for £80,000, or by the thin pale scar on a brow she had no business remembering. She filled the scuttle to the brim. She lifted it. The iron handle bit into her small calloused palm, and she shifted her grip and bore the weight up the cellar stair without spilling so much as a single black flake onto the worn stone. At the top of the stair she paused once more, in the narrow passage where the servants' candles burned low in their tin sconces, and she lifted her face a final time to listen. The wind had risen. The rain was now a long, even hiss against the high windows above the back hall, and the panes rattled in their lead, and somewhere in the upper part of the house a loose shutter began to beat a slow, uneven knock against the stone, and Eleanor Hart, 22 years old, parish orphan, lower housemaid, holder of 4 folded verses above the small, steady drum of her heart, drew in one long breath of the cold air of Ashfern Hall and went on with the work that had been given her to do. The storm settled in over the moor for the night, and the house and the girl and the man who would within 7 hours unlock a carved oak door for her without yet knowing he meant to, all waited inside it, without yet knowing they waited. By the 7th hour the storm had taken the moor entirely. Rain hammered the slate roofs of Ashfern Hall in long, slanted sheets, and the chimneys moaned under it like animals woken before their season. Inside, Eleanor Hart moved along the west corridor with a brass scuttle of coals against her hip, her gray wool skirts dragging at the carpet edge, her cap straight, her face still as a closed book. She had been working since 5 that morning. She would work until the household clock chimed 11. There were 31 fires laid in Ashfern Hall, and on a night like this, every one of them mattered. A clap of thunder split directly over the east tower. The walls answered it with a fine gray tremor in the plaster. Eleanor did not flinch. The Earl's house had taught her not to flinch at small things, and she had learned the lesson quickly. She set the scuttle down outside the music room, knelt, swept the cold grate, laid kindling in the careful little pyramid Mrs. Whitlock required, struck the flint, blew once. The fire took on the second breath. She rose, lifted the scuttle, moved on. In the long gallery the gas lamps were still burning yellow, but they hissed unevenly. The pressure in the line was wrong. She noted it the way a stable boy notes a horse's altered gait, without yet naming the consequence. 3 steps later the consequence named itself. Lightning struck somewhere very close, near enough that the great mullioned windows turned white from edge to edge, and every gas lamp in the long gallery died at once, as though a single breath had passed across each flame. Eleanor stood absolutely still in the new dark. The house, she thought, would now be a different house. She had served in it for 7 months, but the house she knew was a house of roots lit by gas brackets and brass sconces and the orange thread under the housekeeper's door. In total darkness, Ashfern Hall became a different geometry, older, less generous. She set the scuttle against the wainscot. She felt along the panel until her fingers caught the small recess where the night candles were kept, for exactly this sort of failure, and she drew out a single tallow stub. Then, on a second thought she would later be unable to explain, she went back along the gallery and into the small service pantry beside the dining room, and from the locked cupboard, whose key Mrs. Whitlock had entrusted to her in March, she took down one of the heavy silver candlesticks reserved for the family rooms. She fitted a fresh beeswax taper into it, lit the taper from her tallow, and snuffed the tallow against her palm. The silver in her hand was cold and very heavy. It steadied her wrist the way a stone steadies a sleeve. "Miss Hart." Mrs. Whitlock had appeared at the head of the servants' stair with her own candle and her keys swinging. Even in the half-light, her cap was unimpeachably arranged. "The gas is gone in the whole north wing. Mr. Hobson is gone down to the cellar with Tom. Until they have it again, take the family floors. Light the bedchamber sconces in the west wing. Master rooms first. Do not, on any account, enter the east corridor. His lordship is at home." "Yes, Mrs. Whitlock." "The west wing. Do you hear me, Miss Hart?" "The west wing. Yes, Mrs. Whitlock." The older woman looked at her a moment longer than was strictly necessary, with that gaze she used when she was weighing whether a girl had heard with her ears only or also with her bones. Whatever she found, she let it pass. "Go." Eleanor went. She climbed the back stair with the silver candlestick held a little out from her body, the way a child carries something borrowed. The flame leaned, recovered, leaned again where a draught found her through the shuttered window on the landing. She counted the turnings under her breath because the dark had stolen her usual marks. First landing, second landing, the small recessed Madonna in her niche. At the head of the third flight, she stepped through the green baize door and into the family floor, and there she made her mistake. It was a small mistake. It was the kind of mistake any new servant might make in a house she had walked for only 7 months, on a night when the gaslight had betrayed every familiar shadow. She turned right, because at the foot of the stair right had been west, and she did not allow for the half-turn the back stair takes between the second and third story, which placed her, when she came through the baize door, facing not west but east. She walked 3 doors down. She lifted her candle to the sconce above the carved oak panel and saw, in the trembling light, an unfamiliar grain. The wood here was darker, the brass plate of the keyhole was older, a faint smell of cedar and something else, ink perhaps, or the warm dust of a fire that had been burning for hours already. She did not yet understand where she was. She understood only that a door stood ajar by perhaps 2 fingers, and that warm orange light fell through the gap onto the runner at her feet, in a long, thin stripe, and that the air through the gap was breathing as though someone inside were breathing too. She thought, the master rooms first. Mrs. Whitlock had said the master rooms first. She pushed the door. It moved on hinges so well oiled they made no sound at all. The light from inside spread across her gray skirt, across her white apron, across the silver of her candlestick, and gilded her where she stood. The room was very large. A fire had been built up high in a marble chimney-piece, and was throwing copper light along a turkey carpet of deep red. A great mahogany writing table stood at an angle to the hearth, scattered with papers held down by a glass weight. There were books along one wall, leather, dark. There was a tall window seat with the curtains drawn back over the storm, and the rain moved on the black glass in living silver. And there was a man. He was standing at the chimney-piece with one hand flat upon the marble, and the other holding a small glass that caught the fire and threw it back. He was not in coat or cravat. The white linen of his shirt was open at 3 buttons across the chest, the cuffs turned back to mid-forearm. He was barefoot upon the carpet. His black hair, ordinarily combed back from his brow, had fallen loose over his temple, and the firelight caught along the thin, pale line of an old scar that cut vertically through his right brow. He turned his head, slowly, as though he had heard the door open only at the last possible moment, and his eyes found her. They were gray, almost silver in that light, under straight black brows. They did not widen, they did not narrow. They simply rested upon her with the perfect stillness of a hawk that has not yet decided whether the small thing on the moor below is worth a flight. Eleanor's hand closed very tightly around the silver stem of the candlestick. She knew, then, where she was. She knew it before her mind had finished assembling the name. She knew it by the cut of his shoulders, by the absence of livery in the room, by the deference even the carpet seemed to pay him under his bare feet. She knew it by the way the air itself had organized around him. The East Corridor, his lordship's private apartment. Do not, on any account, enter the East Corridor. She did not move. She did not lower her candle, which was suddenly absurd, since the room was already lit. She did not lift her eyes from the bridge of his nose, because to lift them to his eyes again seemed an unbearable presumption, and to drop them to his open collar seemed worse. In her own ears her voice came very small, very even. "Wrong room, milord." She had meant to say more. A whole sentence, her apologies, her station. The error of the stair. The words were all there, already formed inside her throat, and yet when her mouth opened only those 3 syllables came out, and they came out almost as a breath. He did not answer, he did not move, he only looked at her, and his hand left the marble of the chimney-piece and came to rest, with great quiet, against his own thigh. Eleanor took 1 step back. The carpet hushed her heel. The door, which she had pushed wider with her shoulder, framed her in copper light from the room and black shadow from the corridor, and she felt herself caught between the two, as though pinned to a board. She took a 2nd step back. The candle in her hand dipped, righted itself. "Forgive me, milord," she said, and this sentence came out whole. "The gas has failed in the long gallery. Mrs. Whitlock sent me to light the west wing. I mistook the stair." His head tilted, perhaps half an inch. It was not a nod. It was the small adjustment a man makes when he is hearing something he had not expected to hear, and is choosing whether to answer it. "Mrs. Whitlock," he repeated. His voice was lower than she had imagined it might be. It came from far back in the chest and carried no haste in it whatever. "Sent you?" "Yes, milord." "Up the back stair?" "Yes, milord." "Which turns once between the 2nd and 3rd stories?" "Yes, milord." The corner of his mouth, which she had heard described in the servants' hall as a mouth that did not move, did something then which was not quite a smile, but was no longer perfectly still either. He set the small glass down upon the marble of the mantel without looking at where it went. "An honest mistake," he said. "Yes, milord, I beg your pardon, I shall go." She made her curtsy. It was the curtsy Mrs. Whitlock had drilled into her the 2nd day, low enough to acknowledge a peer of the realm, brief enough not to detain him. She did it without spilling the candle, which she counted, in that moment, the only competence remaining to her. She turned. Her hand found the heavy brass of the door. She drew the door towards her and stepped into the corridor and pulled it after her, and at the very last instant, before the latch took, she glanced back through the narrowing gap. He had not moved from the chimney-piece. He had not lowered his hand. His gray eyes had not left her. The latch clicked. Eleanor walked. She did not run. To run would have been to admit, to the empty corridor and to herself, that something had happened, and she was not yet willing to admit that anything had happened. She walked along the runner, past the carved oak panels, past the small recess where a Sèvres vase stood blue in her candle's wash, past the green baize door, down the 3rd flight, and the 2nd and the 1st, until she came out into the gallery where the gas was still dead, and only then did she stop. She stood in the dark with her back against the cold wood of the wainscot and her candle held out in front of her, and she discovered that her hand was shaking very finely, the way a long grass shakes when there is no wind anyone else can feel. She set the candlestick on the floor. She pressed both hands to her apron, palm flat. She counted to 10 under her breath, in Latin, because Latin had always steadied her father at his pulpit, and what had steadied her father might steady her now. By 8 she could feel her breath again. By 10 she could feel her feet. She picked up the candle. She picked up her abandoned scuttle. She climbed the back stair a 2nd time, and this time she counted the half-turn, and this time she went west. She lit the sconces of the west wing one by one. She lit the bedchamber of the late countess, kept aired and empty these 11 years. She lit the dressing room beside it. She lit the long west corridor along its full length, 12 brackets, each with its small clean flame, and the wing came back to itself around her in soft yellow. The whole while her face did not alter, her hands did not falter. A girl who had laid 30 fires before breakfast did not betray herself over a closed door and 3 words. But underneath the apron, underneath the gray wool, somewhere beneath the bone, a small and exact thing had been struck, the way a tuning fork is struck, and would not stop singing. She did not yet know his name spoken aloud in his own voice. She did not yet know that he had been standing at that chimney-piece for nearly 2 hours before she had opened his door, turning a small glass in his hand and not drinking from it, and thinking, with the quiet and patient violence with which he thought about most things, of a girl in a gray dress whom he had watched, 3 months ago, replace 4 candles in the library without once lifting her eyes to him, and of the 4 lines of verse he had later found, folded very small, slipped between the pages of a cowper. What he did not say, to her or to himself in that lit room, was that he had heard her steps in the corridor and had not crossed to lock the door. Eleanor finished the west wing. She came back down. She presented herself in the servants' hall, where Mrs. Whitlock looked up from the housekeeping book. "Done?" "Done, Mrs. Whitlock." "Any difficulty?" A small pause. The fire in the servants' grate snapped once. "None, Mrs. Whitlock." The housekeeper's eyes rested on her a moment, as they had rested on her in the dark of the back stair, with that same measuring weight. Whatever she found, again, she let pass. She drew a line through an entry in her book. "Go to bed, Miss Hart. The gas will be back before morning, and the grates begin again at 5. "Yes, Mrs. Whitlock." Eleanor climbed the attic stair to the room she shared with 2 other maids, both already asleep. She undressed in the small, cold space between her cot and the sloped wall. She folded her gray dress along its careful seams. She laid her apron flat. She slipped her hand into the pocket and felt for the 4 folded verses there, and found them, and did not take them out. She lay down on the narrow cot. She drew the coarse blanket to her chin. She closed her eyes. Sleep would not come to her at once. Sleep, on the contrary, retreated from her in slow, steady degrees, the way the tide retreats from a flat shore, leaving everything bare. She lay with her eyes shut and listened to the breathing of the 2 maids beside her, and to the slackening rain in the gutters, and to her own pulse in the hollow under her jaw, and against the dark of her closed lids she saw, again and again, a door she had pushed open, and a man standing barefoot in firelight, who had not asked her to leave. She turned upon her side. She turned upon her back. She made her hands lie flat upon the blanket the way a corpse's hands are made to lie, and waited to be unmade by morning. In a great bedchamber on the floor below the family floor, 3 corridors and 2 staircases away, an Earl who had not moved from his chimney-piece for some quarter of an hour, after a maid had closed his door, at last reached out and, with the same hand that had rested upon the marble, very quietly turned the heavy bronze key in the lock. Not to keep her out, to keep himself in, until morning. The rain went on across the moor for another 2 hours. Then, near 3, it eased. By dawn the gas was running clean again in every line of the house, and the household clock chimed 5, and a young woman in a gray wool dress and a white apron carried a brass scuttle of coals along the west corridor, as though nothing whatever had happened, and waited, without yet knowing she was waiting, for the carriages that would arrive on the gravel before noon. He crossed the room before the candle in her hand had time to gutter. 4 strides, no more. The Persian rug swallowed the sound of his bare feet, and Eleanor, retreating with the brass candlestick held like a small shield between her ribs and the world, found that the door she had meant to slip through was no longer behind her. He had reached past her shoulder. The flat of his palm had pressed the heavy oak shut. The bronze key in the lock turned with one quiet, deliberate click. She did not move. She could not have said afterwards whether it was fear that held her or the simple physical fact of him, the wall of linen and breath very near her cheek, the dark spill of his hair against the firelight, the long arm braced above her head so that she stood, for a moment, inside the shape of him without being touched at all. "Stay," he said. It was not a command in the manner of masters. It was lower than that, and slower, and it cost him something to say it. The single syllable seemed to take the air out of the room. Eleanor kept her eyes on the 3rd button of his open shirt, because to look up was impossible. The candle wax began to run warm down her knuckles. She did not feel it. "Milord," she whispered, "I shall be missed." "You shall not. Mrs. Whitlock sleeps 3 corridors away, and the gas is out across the house. No one will pass this door until the storm has gone." He paused. His voice was perfectly level. "I am not keeping you here. The key is in the lock. Turn it and go, if that is what you wish." He stepped back 1 pace. Only 1. It was enough that the air between them moved again. She did not turn the key. The fire snapped behind him. Outside, the storm threw a fistful of water against the long windows of the east wing, and the candle in her hand at last guttered and died. Only the hearth lit them now, copper on the line of his jaw, gold on the white linen of his shirt, a low red glow against the gray wool of her gown. She set the dead candle on the small table beside the door, because to keep holding it had begun to feel absurd, and because her fingers needed something to do. "Why am I here?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment before he answered, and when he did, he answered as a man who had rehearsed the sentence a great many times in the privacy of his own skull. "Because for 3 months I have been a liar in my own house, and tonight the storm has put out the gas, and I am tired." She did not understand him. She waited. "The library," he said. "Last August, the afternoon of the heat wave. You were standing on the stepladder beside the south window with a feather duster and a book of Cowper open on the rail, and you were reading it. Not pretending, reading. Your lips moved on a line about the stricken deer. You did not know I was in the doorway." Eleanor's throat closed. "I left without speaking," he said. "I had Mrs. Whitlock change the duster rotation the next morning, so that the library would not fall to you again. I told myself it was for the books. It was not for the books." A small, dry sound escaped him that was almost a laugh, and was not at all amused. "I have been watching for you in corridors for 3 months, like a schoolboy, in my own house." "Milord?" "Julian," he said. "I cannot. Tonight you can." The wind shoved the casements. Somewhere below them, in the kitchens, a copper pot fell from a hook and rang once against the flags, and the house was silent again. Eleanor pressed her palms flat against the oak panel behind her, because she had begun to tremble, and she did not want him to see it. He saw it. He did not move closer. He went, instead, to the hearth, and knelt on the rug there in his bare feet, and turned over a log with the iron poker, as though they were two strangers waiting out the rain in a coaching inn. The flame caught and brightened. His back was to her. It was, she understood, a kindness. He was giving her the door. She thought of the 4 crumpled verses in the pocket of her apron, of Mrs. Whitlock's recital of the rule at 5 o'clock that morning, of the 7 months of careful invisibility she had built around herself in this house like a second wool gown. She thought of her father's bookshop in Holborn, burned in the autumn of 1815, and of her mother's grave at St. Pancras, and of the 4 shillings a week she sent in a small folded paper to her brother at the charity school in York. She thought of all the doors she had passed through obediently in her short life, and of the one door, now, that she had been ordered to leave and had not left. She did not turn the key. "You said 3 months," she heard herself say. "Why tonight?" He set the poker down across the brass dogs and rose, and turned, and the firelight took the line of the scar above his right brow and made it silver. He did not come towards her again. He stayed at the hearth, 6 feet of carpet between them, and spoke as one speaks at the close of a long ride. "On Tuesday next, the Duke of Holbrook brings his daughter to this house," he said. "The contract is drawn, £80,000 against the Ashfern entail, and a seat for me in his pocket borough. My solicitor carries the papers on Wednesday. I shall sign them. I shall sign them because my father signed worse, and his father before him, and the roof of the north wing will not mend itself with my preferences." He paused. "After Wednesday I shall not look at you again, Eleanor. I shall not pass you in the gallery. I shall not be in any room you enter. That is what gentlemen do, in such cases, and I am told I am a gentleman." He drew a breath. "So I asked, tonight, when the gas went out, whether God in his mercy meant to give a coward 1 hour of his own life before he sold the rest. The wrong room was not yours. It was mine." There was no answer to be made to such a speech, and Eleanor did not try to make one. She crossed the carpet instead, slowly, the heavy ring of keys at her belt giving it small, dull music, and she stopped in front of him at the distance of a hand. She did not look at his eyes. She looked at the place where his shirt fell open at the throat, and at the small white line of an old scar there she had not seen from across the room. "1 hour, Milord. 1 hour if you wish it. And on Wednesday you sign." "On Wednesday I sign." "And after?" "After," he said, very quietly, "I shall remember." She lifted her hand then. It was not a brave gesture. Her knuckles were red from the kitchen lie, and there was a small ink stain on the side of her smallest finger from the verses she had copied at 4 in the morning by the light of a tallow stub, and the hand shook a little as she raised it. She set her palm flat against the linen above his heart. Under her fingers it was beating very hard. What he did not say then was that he had not slept a full night since August, and that he had taken to walking the long gallery at 3 in the morning, past the portrait of his mother, because she had had the same color of hair as the new maid. What she did not say was that she had copied Cowper from the library a second time, after the rotation was changed, by stealing into that room at 4:30 for 6 mornings in a row, and that she had known, in some small wordless place, exactly whom she was copying him for. Neither said it. The fire said enough. He bent his head. He did not kiss her mouth. He turned his cheek against her temple, where the white cotton cap met the line of her hair, and he stood there for the length of one slow breath, and the long arm came down at last around her shoulders, and held her as a man holds something he has been forbidden for a very long time. The candle at the door was a black wick. The storm, far above them, began at last to ease. The hour did not end at an hour. They did not measure it. Some time after the fire had burned low, he laid his coat about her shoulders, and they sat together on the low couch before the hearth, and he told her, in the manner of men who have never told anyone anything, about a brother dead at Salamanca in 12, and a mother dead of grief 8 months after, and a father who had drunk the rents through, and left him at 20 a title, and a mortgage, and a vault of letters from creditors in Lombard Street. She told him, in return, about her father's small bookshop and the smell of damp leather after the fire, and about her brother at the charity school, and about the 4 shillings folded in paper every Friday. He did not pity her. He listened as a man listens to a deposition, with his eyes on her face, and when she was finished, he said only, "Your brother shall be at Harrow by Michaelmas," and she shook her head and said, "No, Milord, I do not want anything bought," and he was silent, and did not press, and she understood that he had heard her. Once, much later, she rose to go. He did not hold her. He stood and crossed the carpet with her to the door, and turned the bronze key in the lock himself, and opened it the width of her shoulder, and then, before she passed through, he caught her hand and turned it palm up in his own, and looked at it as a scholar looks at a page. The ink stain, the reddened knuckles, the small old burn on the ball of her thumb from a kitchen kettle in another house, in another year. He bent his head over her hand and pressed his mouth, once, to the inside of her wrist where the pulse ran, and let her go. "Wednesday," he said. "Wednesday, Milord." She did not look back. She walked the length of the east corridor in her stockinged feet with her shoes in one hand and the dead candle in the other, and she went down the servants' stair, and she reached her own narrow room at the top of the house as the long clock in the hall struck 4, and she sat on the edge of the iron bedstead with the coat he had forgotten to take back across her knees, and she did not weep. She was, instead, very still. By 4:30 she had folded the coat in 3, and laid it inside the lid of her small painted box beneath the 4 verses and a lock of her mother's hair. By 5 she was in the grey wool gown again with the white apron pinned and the cap fixed and the brass scuttle in her hand, and she was laying the morning fire in the breakfast room as though nothing whatever had happened. Mrs. Whitlock found her there at 6 and looked at her sharply over the steel half-moons, because Mrs. Whitlock had been a housekeeper for 31 years, and there was a quality to the silence of the girl at the hearth that she did not entirely like. But Eleanor's hands were steady on the bellows, and her apron was clean, and the fire took on the first breath, and Mrs. Whitlock, having no charge to bring, brought none. "Holbrook arrives at noon," the housekeeper said. "The west bedchambers are aired. You will not pass the green saloon while the company is at tea. You will carry no tray into a room where Lady Cecilia Marchwood is seated. Is that understood, Hart?" "Yes, Mrs. Whitlock." "You are very pale this morning." "The storm kept me wakeful, ma'am." The older woman studied her another moment and then turned away to her keys, and Eleanor knelt before the hearth and pushed the kindling further beneath the coals, and did not let her face change at all. In the long week that followed she did not see him. He did not pass her in the gallery. He did not call for a tray in the library. He did not ride out at the hour she carried hot water to the east wing. Once, on the Tuesday, she heard his voice in the great hall, giving an order to Cobb the butler about the disposition of the carriages, and she stood very still on the back stair, with a basket of folded linen against her hip, until the voice was gone. He was as good as his word. But on the Friday morning she found, set on the small deal table in the still room where she took her breakfast alone at 5:30, a single book. It was a small octavo, bound in dark green calf, very plain. There was no note. She opened the cover. It was Cowper. Inside the flyleaf, in a hand she did not know but knew at once, 3 words had been written in brown ink, "For the reader." She closed the book. She did not take it to her room. She wrapped it in a square of clean linen and laid it inside the flour bin behind the great earthen jar, because a maid found with a gentleman's book in her box would lose her place by the next post, and she went on with her mourning as though no book had ever been laid for her in any still room in England. On the Saturday, Mr. Edmund Blackwood arrived from London in a hired chaise with a leather pasteboard case under his arm, and was taken at once to the Earl's study, where he remained 2 hours. Eleanor, carrying coal up the back stair, heard nothing of what passed in that room. But when she came down again, the solicitor was standing in the hall pulling on his black gloves, and his calm brown eyes passed across her face once, without expression, as though he had been told what she looked like and was confirming a fact, and then he was gone into the chaise, and the chaise was gone down the drive. That afternoon she was sent by Mrs. Whitlock to turn out the linen press in the small green saloon, because the Marchwood party would take tea there on the morrow. She knelt on the floor between the cedar shelves and folded sheets and counted pillow slips and listened, without meaning to the wheels of a heavy traveling carriage as they came at last up the gravel of the long drive and stopped before the south portico of the house. She rose. She crossed to the window. She did not lift the curtain. She looked through the thin gap at the side where the brocade did not quite meet the frame. The footman had let down the step. A small gloved hand in white pelisse had taken the offered arm. A young woman in a long white cloak edged with ermine descended very slowly to the gravel and turned her face up towards the house, and even at that distance, through the cold November light, Eleanor saw the small, satisfied set of the rose-pale mouth and the color of the hair beneath the white velvet hood, platinum and elaborate, dressed in curls upon the ear. Behind her, the Duke of Holbrook climbed down stiffly, leaning on an ebony cane. And then, on the top step of the south portico, the great door opened from the inside, and Julian Ashcroft, Earl of Ashfern, came out, hatless, in his black coat and his grey waistcoat, with his hands clasped behind his back, and bowed to Lady Cecilia Marchwood, and offered her his arm. Eleanor watched, through the gap in the curtain, as the gloved hand was laid upon the black sleeve. She did not let the curtain fall. She let it go, very gently, with her fingertips, so that it should not move. She knelt again at the linen press. She counted the pillow slips. She found that she had miscounted, and counted them again, and got the same number, and laid them in their 3 neat piles upon the cedar shelf, and rose, and smoothed her apron with the flat of both hands, and went down to the kitchen to fetch the tea. The first carriage came up the avenue at 10:30, and Eleanor heard it from the still room before anyone in the front of the house could have heard it at all. She knew the sound of the gravel under wheels the way a shepherd knows the sound of his own dogs. 2 horses, a heavy coach, and behind it, the lighter rattle of a chaise. She set down the jar of black currant preserve she had been weighing and wiped her hands on the inside of her apron where it would not show. Mrs. Whitlock came through the door without knocking, which was, in itself, a small piece of news. "Marchwood," she said, "3 carriages, get the green drawing-room opened. Fires in both grates. The blue china, not the everyday." She paused at the door, "and put a clean apron on, girl. Not that one." Eleanor did not say that her apron was clean. She only inclined her head and went up the back stair 2 steps at a time, which was a thing she had been beaten for as a child and had never quite unlearned. In the linen press at the top of the stair she changed her apron, and tied the strings twice, and felt, for one bright second, the small hard shape of the folded paper still in the pocket of the gown beneath, and then she went down. The green drawing-room had not been used since September. The shutters complained when she folded them back, and a long, pale bar of November sun fell across the carpet and showed the dust suspended in it like flour. She lit the fires herself, kneeling on the hearth flag, because the under-housemaid was at the back door taking in the bread. The kindling caught at the first flame. She had a steady hand for that work. She had always had a steady hand. She was setting the last of the cups on the lacquer tray when the front bell sounded, and after that there was nothing in her that was not listening. She did not look up when the doors of the drawing-room opened. She had been taught not to. She heard the voices come in, 3 of them, and then a 4th, lower, that she would have known in a forest at night. "Lady Cecilia Marchwood," Mrs. Whitlock announced, in the voice she reserved for titles. "His Grace the Duke of Holbrook. The Honorable Mr. Marchwood." Eleanor straightened, with her hands at the front of her apron, and made her curtsy to the carpet, as a servant should, and as she rose she saw, only because she could not help seeing, that Lady Cecilia Marchwood was upon the Earl's arm. She was very fair. That was the first true thing. Her hair was the color of new straw and dressed in clusters of tight pale curls above each ear, with a thin band of pearls woven through them. Her gown was the white of fresh milk, and her sash was the deep blue-green of a peacock's breast, and her gloves came to the middle of her upper arm, and there was, against her throat, a triple rope of pearls with a sapphire the size of a thumbnail set into the clasp. She was perhaps an inch taller than Eleanor. She carried herself like a thing that had been measured. Her hand lay upon Julian's sleeve, as though she had laid it there 100 times before, and meant to lay it there 100 times again. He did not look at Eleanor. He did not look at her when he led Lady Cecilia to the chair by the fire, nor when he handed the Duke of Holbrook to the larger chair opposite, nor when Mr. Marchwood, a pleasant young man with weak chin and his sister's blue eyes, took the settee. He did not look at her when Mrs. Whitlock said, in the soft, polished voice that was kept for guests, "Heart will pour, your grace." He did not look at her, and Eleanor understood, with a small clean shock that was almost relief, that he was not looking on purpose. She crossed to the tray. The teapot was the heavy silver one with the chased rim, and it was full, and she lifted it with both hands as she had been taught, the left hand steadying the lid. The tea came out of the spout in a thin, true line. She did not spill. She did not rattle the cup against the saucer. She had been doing this work for 7 months, and her hands obeyed her even when the rest of her was elsewhere. "Milk, your grace?" "A little." "Sugar, my lord?" "None." She knew this. She had brought him his tea on 6 mornings in the library, and he had never taken sugar on any of them. She asked anyway, because to know was to claim, and she had not, in the green drawing-room, any right to claim anything at all. She passed the cup to him on the saucer, and he received it with his right hand, and for the space of half a heartbeat, the small finger of his right hand touched the small finger of her left, beneath the rim of the saucer, where no eye in the room could possibly have seen. She did not let it tremble in her hand. She passed the next cup to Lady Cecilia, who took it without looking at her at all, the way one takes a thing from a thing. She poured for Mr. Marchwood and then for Mrs. Whitlock, who would not drink it, and then she stepped back into the alcove beside the long case clock, and stood with her hands folded in front of her apron and her eyes upon the carpet. Conversation began. The Duke of Holbrook spoke of his journey, and of the bridges between Carlisle and Hexham, and of an inn at Otterburn, at which the mutton had not been creditable. Lady Cecilia spoke of the milliner in Bond Street who had made up her travelling bonnet, and of a play she had seen, which she had not cared for, and of a girl at Almack's who had married very badly indeed. Mr. Marchwood spoke of horses. The Earl spoke very little, and when he did, it was in the dry, exact voice he used for tenants and for solicitors, and Eleanor heard, beneath it, what no one else in the room could possibly have heard, the tightness of a man holding a length of rope that was already burning his hands. "Ashfern," said Lady Cecilia presently, with the small white laugh she used to draw an eye back to herself, "you have not asked after my mother. How does her grace?" "Tolerably. She is at Bath. The waters do not agree with her, but London does not agree with her either, so she takes whichever poison is in season." She turned her smile upon him. It was a very pretty smile. "She bids me say that the contracts are with Mr. Pelham, and that Papa wishes to sign upon St. Stephen's Day, so that the announcement may go into the New Year's papers." There was, in the room, the smallest possible silence. "St. Stephen's Day," the Earl repeated, as if he were turning the words over to look at the underside of them. "In 6 weeks, Papa is firm." The Duke of Holbrook made a low sound in his throat, which was meant for agreement. "It is sooner than we had spoken of," the Earl said. "Is it?" Lady Cecilia opened her fan and shut it and laid it across her knee. "I had thought we had spoken of December." "We had spoken," he said, "of the new year." "Oh well, Papa has spoken of December, which is rather more to the point." She lifted her tea. Her eyes, over the rim of the cup, were the color of a window in February. "You will not, I trust, make me into a long engagement, Ashfern. I am told they are very fashionable. I have never cared for fashion." "No," he said. "You have not. It was a small thing. It might have been a compliment. It was, Eleanor understood, the precise opposite of a compliment, and Lady Cecilia did not hear it, because the Earl of Ashfern had been speaking in that voice all his life, and the women he had spoken it to had, for the most part, mistaken it for civility. "Then St. Stephen's," said the Duke of Holbrook, in the satisfied voice of a man who has bought a horse cheap. "We shall send for Pelham." Send for Blackwood as well, the Earl said. The Duke lifted his heavy gray brows. Your own man? At a signing? My own man at every signing. As you please, my lord. As I please. He had not raised his voice. He had not turned his head. Eleanor, in the alcove, saw the line of his jaw and the small white pressure at the corner of his mouth, and she thought, with the strange clarity that had been in her since the night before, he is buying himself time. He does not yet know for what. Lady Cecilia rose. The men rose with her. I should like, she said sweetly, to see the long gallery before luncheon. Mamma was used to say that the Ashfern portraits were the finest north of the Trent. She laid her hand again upon the Earl's sleeve, and this time she let it stay there a fraction longer than was necessary, the way a person who owns a thing rests a hand upon it in the presence of those who do not. Will you show me, my lord? With pleasure. He did not look at Eleanor as he led Lady Cecilia from the room. He did not look at her as the Duke followed, leaning upon his ebony stick, nor as Mr. Marchwood passed her with a small civil nod that he had probably given to 100 girls in 100 drawing-rooms and would not, by evening, remember. Mrs. Whitlock went last, closing the doors behind her with the soft proprietary click of a woman who had been closing those doors for 30 years. Eleanor stood alone in the green drawing-room with the half-emptied cups. She did not weep. She did not sit. She crossed to the tray and gathered the cups onto it, one by one, in the order in which she had poured them, and she carried the tray down the back stair to the scullery, and she washed each cup herself, with her own hands, in water that was almost too hot to bear, because she wished, very much, to feel something that she had chosen to feel. It was while she was drying the Earl's cup that she understood. He had not looked at her. He had touched her finger beneath the saucer, where no one could see, and then he had not looked at her. And he had not looked at her not because he had forgotten her, and not because he was ashamed of her, but because he could not trust his face. He had let the contract stand, and had asked for his own solicitor at the signing, and had made the small dry remark about fashion, and through the whole of it, he had kept his eyes from her, as a man keeps his hand from a flame he means to put out, in his own time, by his own method, without burning the house down with it first. He was not discarding her. He was protecting her. The cup was dry. She set it back upon the shelf, in its proper place, and she stood for a long moment with her hands flat upon the wood, and she breathed once, slowly, all the way in and all the way out. Behind her, the scullery door opened. "Hart," said Mrs. Whitlock. "Yes, ma'am. His lordship has asked that the small parlor be made ready for Mr. Blackwood, who comes from Newcastle this evening. He has further asked that you carry up the tray when Mr. Blackwood arrives, no one else." Eleanor turned. The governess was watching her over the half-moons of her spectacles, and there was, behind the steel of them, a thing that might almost have been pity, or might almost have been warning, and was perhaps both. "Yes, ma'am. You will mind your face, Hart." "I shall, ma'am." "And you will not be in the long gallery this afternoon." "No, ma'am." Mrs. Whitlock looked at her a moment longer. Then she said in quite a different voice, "There is a clause, girl, in every contract in England, that a clever solicitor can find if a clever master tells him where to look. I have lived in this house 41 years. I know what I know." She turned and went out and closed the door behind her. Eleanor stood very still in the scullery with the smell of hot water and lye soap about her, and somewhere above her, in the long gallery, the Earl of Ashfern was walking his betrothed past the portrait of his grandfather, and somewhere beyond the avenue, the carriage of Mr. Edmund Blackwood was already turning out of Newcastle upon the North Road, and the afternoon light was beginning to slant. She untied her apron. She tied it again, more tightly. She went up to lay the fire in the small parlor, because that was the next thing, and the next thing was the only thing a servant ever did. The small parlor faced east, and at this hour the room was already in shadow. She knelt at the grate and built the fire as her mother had taught her, the kindling laid in a small open hand, the logs propped against one another like men leaning at a fair. She struck the flint, the flame took. She watched it for the length of one slow breath, and then she rose, and she set the tinderbox back in its place upon the mantel, and she straightened the inkstand upon the writing table, and she drew the curtains halfway, because Mr. Blackwood, she remembered, did not like a glare upon his papers. There were 2 chairs at the writing table. She moved the second a half-inch closer, then she moved it back. From the long gallery, 2 floors above her, She could just hear the murmur of voices, the Duke's heavy laugh, the lighter answer of his daughter. The Earl, she noted, did not laugh. He had not laughed once, to her knowledge, in 7 months. She thought of the small folded paper in the pocket of the gown she had taken off. 4 verses she had copied out by candle on a Sunday in October, the ink a little blotted at the lower corner where her sleeve had caught it. She had carried those 4 verses against her hip for 31 days. She had believed, when she carried them, that she carried a secret. She understood now that she had carried a promise, and that the promise had been made not by her, but to her, by a man who had not yet found the words for it. She left the small parlor and went down the back stair to wait for the carriage from Newcastle. In the kitchen passage she passed a long looking-glass that had been set there 100 years ago for footmen to straighten their wigs. She did not look at it. She had not, for 7 months, looked at her own face in any glass at Ashfern Hall. Today she stopped. She turned. She looked. A small, pale woman with steady eyes looked back at her. The cap was straight. The apron was clean. The mouth did not tremble. "Very well," she said aloud, to the woman in the glass, in a voice no louder than the turning of a page. "Very well, then." She walked on. She did not yet know what he meant to do. She knew only that he meant to do something, and that he had bought, with a single touch of one finger to another beneath the rim of a Wedgwood saucer, the right to ask her, when the time came, to trust him. She climbed the back stair with the kindling in her arms, and as she reached the half-landing she heard, very faint and very far above her, the bright false laugh of Lady Cecilia Marchwood, ringing along the gallery like a coin dropped onto a marble floor. She did not flinch. She went on up. The morning of the green-room reception arrived under a sky the color of bruised pewter, and by 10 o'clock Ashfern Hall had been transformed into a stage that did not belong to anyone who actually lived in it. Footmen Eleanor had never seen before moved along the corridors in livery borrowed from Holbrook's London house, carrying silver salvers and porcelain stacks taller than their own heads. Mrs. Whitlock walked at the head of them with her ring of 30 keys striking her hip at each step, her mouth pressed into the thin line she wore when she could not afford to feel anything at all. Eleanor was given a task that was meant to be a mercy. She was to remain at the long sideboard beneath the eastern window of the green room and serve tea. Nothing more. No fetching, no clearing, no crossing the carpet to where the guests sat. The sideboard, the urn, the tray, the steady pouring of cups handed off to passing footmen. Mrs. Whitlock had repeated the instruction twice in the still room before they came up, her small brown eyes fixed somewhere just above Eleanor's left shoulder. "You stand there. You pour. You speak to no one. Do you understand me, child?" "Yes, Mrs. Whitlock." "Pour with 2 hands today. Your right has been unsteady this week." It had not been unsteady. They both knew that. But Eleanor curtsied and said nothing, because she had learned in 7 months that Mrs. Whitlock's small unkindnesses were the only language in which the woman knew how to give protection. The guests came in by carriage from half the great houses within 40 miles. The Marchwood party arrived last, by design. Lady Cecilia entered on her father's arm in white muslin, embroidered with silver thread, the peacock blue sash beneath her bust, catching the gray light from the window like a struck match. Her cashpot of platinum curls had been built up over her ears since dawn, and the 3 strands of pearls at her throat ended in a sapphire pendant the size of a sparrow's egg. She passed the sideboard without seeing it. Eleanor was a piece of furniture between an urn and a window, and Lady Cecilia had been raised never to look at furniture. The Earl of Ashfern entered 3 paces behind. He did not glance toward the sideboard either, and Eleanor understood that perfectly now. The careful aversion was the only shield he had left to offer her in this room, and she stood inside it and did not lift her eyes. The Duke of Holbrook took the largest chair beside the fire as if it had been made for him, which in a sense it had, since he had paid for the renovations of this house twice over in dowry installments not yet released. He laid his ebony cane across his knees, set his ringed hand upon its gold knob, and surveyed the room with the slow satisfaction of a man inspecting livestock he had already bought. For half an hour the conversation moved along the lines of weather and roads, of who had been seen in Bath, of the regrettable cough afflicting the Dowager Lady Northam. Eleanor poured. Her hands did not tremble. The urn hissed quietly into each cup. Footmen carried the cups away on small trays of polished mahogany, and the trays returned empty, and she poured again. By the end of that half hour, she had begun to believe she might survive the morning intact. It was then that Lady Cecilia rose from her seat by the fire and crossed the room. There was no warning in it. She rose as one rises to inspect a curiosity at the far wall, a portrait perhaps, and her path took her past the sideboard at an angle that no observer of fashion could have predicted. Mrs. Whitlock, at the door, half lifted her hand and let it fall again. There was nothing she could do. A lady might walk where she pleased in her future husband's house. "Tea, if you please," Lady Cecilia said. Eleanor curtsied. She lifted the small Wedgwood pot of strong, fresh tea from its stand, the porcelain warm against her palm through the linen of the cloth, and began to pour into the cup held out to her on its saucer. The amber stream fell true and clean, 2/3 full, as taste required. Lady Cecilia's wrist tilted. It was the smallest motion in the world, a flex of muscle no wider than the bone beneath it. The saucer angled, the cup with it, and the boiling tea that had been falling neatly into porcelain fell instead across the back of Eleanor's left hand and along the inside of her right wrist where it held the pot. The pain came a half-second after the heat, and the half-second was the worst of it, because in that suspended interval, Eleanor's body knew exactly what had been done to it, and her mind refused to believe a person could have done it on purpose. Then the pain arrived, white and absolute, climbing from her wrist into her shoulder like a struck bell. She did not drop the pot. That was the only thing in the entire morning of which she was afterwards proud. Her fingers, scalded and shaking, kept their grip on the handle, and she set the pot down upon the cloth with a small, precise sound, and she lowered her hands to her sides where the long sleeves of gray wool covered the rising wheels. She did not cry out. She did not move her feet. "Oh," Lady Cecilia said. The single syllable carried beautifully. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The room had already turned. "Oh, you clumsy, clumsy girl." A silence opened in the green room that Eleanor felt against her skin, the way one feels a draft from an unsealed window. "My sleeve," Lady Cecilia continued, holding out the unmarked muslin of her cuff for everyone to inspect. Look what she has done. This is Valenciennes lace, from Brussels. My father had it sent for the betrothal." "Cecilia," the Duke of Holbrook said from his chair, in the indulgent tone of a man whose daughter has only just begun. "No, Papa, I shall not pretend it was nothing. She might have scalded me. She might have ruined the gown. One cannot be expected to take tea in one's future home from servants who do not know how to hold a pot." She turned, slowly, so that her voice would carry to the furthest sofa where the Dowager Lady Northam sat with her ear-trumpet half lifted. "I do beg your pardon, my lady. The standards of this house are not what they shall be." Eleanor stood with her hands at her sides and her chin level, and she felt the skin on the back of her left hand begin to lift in a soft, blistering ridge beneath the wool. She did not look at the Earl. She did not look at Mrs. Whitlock. She looked at a point on the carpet 6 inches in front of Lady Cecilia's silk slipper and waited for what came next, because she understood that the spilling of tea had only been the opening movement. "What is your name, girl?" "Eleanor Hart, my lady." "Eleanor Hart." Lady Cecilia repeated the name as if tasting whether it deserved to remain in use. "And how long have you served here, Eleanor Hart?" 7 months, my lady." 7 months. And in 7 months, no one has thought to teach you how to pour a cup of tea without disgracing the house in front of company. She turned her shoulder a 1/4 inch, addressing the room more than the woman in front of her. It is no wonder, of course. A house without a mistress is a house without standards. Lord Ashfern has been more than generous, I think, to keep on staff who clearly require a firmer hand than he has had leisure to apply. A small, exquisite laugh. Fortunately, that is soon to be remedied. 2 of the younger ladies on the sofa laughed politely with her. The Dowager Lady Northam lowered her ear-trumpet and looked at her gloves. The Duke of Holbrook stroked the gold knob of his cane and smiled. Mrs. Whitlock at the door had gone the color of tallow. The Earl of Ashfern had not moved. He sat in the high-backed chair to the right of the fire with his teacup, the very small painted Wedgwood cup he had been given on entering the room, held in his right hand at the level of his knee. His face showed nothing at all. The cicatrix above his brow caught the light. His gray eyes were fixed upon a panel of the wainscoting behind Eleanor's left shoulder, and they did not move, and they did not move, and they did not move. Eleanor understood, in that moment, that he could not look at her without breaking something he had spent 11 weeks arranging. and that whatever he had been arranging would not arrive in time to spare her this room. She understood it without bitterness. She had known since the morning the carriages came that the world he lived in did not permit certain rescues in public daylight. She curtsied. The reverence she made to Lady Cecilia was not deep. It was the exact measured curtsy owed by a housemaid to a guest of rank, neither short of the form nor a finger's breadth beyond it. She held it perhaps a heartbeat longer than was strictly necessary, and that heartbeat was the only sentence she permitted herself to speak. Then she rose and lifted her tray and walked. She walked the length of the green room with her scalded hands beneath her apron and her eyes upon the door. She did not hurry. To hurry would have been to give the room the pleasure of a fleeing servant, and she did not intend to give it that. She passed Mrs. Whitlock without looking at her. She passed 2 footmen who stepped back to let her through. She crossed the threshold into the corridor, and she walked along the corridor to the service stair, and she descended the service stair, and only when the green baize door swung shut behind her at the bottom did she let her shoulders drop. She did not weep. She did not lean against the wall. She walked along the stone passage to the still room and set the tray upon the deal table and looked at her hands for the first time. The back of the left hand was bright red, the skin already lifted in 2 long blisters across the knuckles. The inside of the right wrist, where she had held the pot, bore a narrow stripe of the same angry color from the cuff of her sleeve to the heel of her palm. She turned the wrist over slowly, almost with curiosity, the way one inspects damage that has happened to someone else. She thought, I have lost the place. I have lost him. I have lost everything that was decided in the small hours of one night, and I shall not weep about it in this room, because Mrs. Whitlock will come down those stairs in 7 minutes, and I will not have her find me weeping. She went to the stone sink. She pumped cold water into the shallow copper basin until her wrists could be lowered into it, and she lowered them, and the cold bit hard, and then began, very slowly, to draw the heat out of the skin. She counted to 100. She counted to 100 a second time. The blistering did not subside, but the throbbing eased enough that she could think along a straight line. By the time she could think, she had decided what she would do. She would not be dismissed in front of Lady Cecilia. She would not give that woman the gift of her removal. She would go up to her own narrow room beneath the eaves, and she would put her 4 folded gowns into the canvas bag with which she had arrived, and she would lay the 4 scraps of paper from the apron pocket between the leaves of the prayer book her mother had left her, and she would walk out of Ashfern Hall by the kitchen door before luncheon was rung. She would leave on her own feet, with her own decision, and the housekeeper would find an empty room and a note in plain hand explaining only that Eleanor Hart had taken her wages owing and gone. It was not a triumph, she knew that. It was the smallest possible piece of dignity to be salvaged from a morning in which dignity had been poured out across the back of her hands. But it was hers to take, and so she would take it.
14 tour.
She lifted her hands from the basin. She dried them very carefully on a square of soft linen, blotting rather than rubbing. She rolled her sleeves down over the wheels and fastened the cuffs and smoothed the wool, and the wool sat against the burns and hurt, and she breathed through the hurt and went out of the still room and up the service stair. She did not meet Mrs. Whitlock on the stair. She heard, somewhere far above her, the bell of the green room ring twice for fresh hot water, and she did not turn back. Someone else would carry it. Someone else would carry everything from this hour forward. Her room beneath the eaves was very cold. The small window over the bed showed a square of the pewter sky and a single rook turning slowly above the elms. She knelt beside the chest at the foot of the bed and lifted the lid. The 4 gowns lay folded as she had left them on Sunday. The canvas bag was beneath them, flat and patient, as if it had been waiting. She lifted the bag out. She did not yet put the gowns into it. She sat back upon her heels and let her scalded hands rest, palms up, upon her thighs, and she looked at them as one looks at evidence in a court of law. The blisters along the knuckles of the left hand had begun to weep clear fluid. The stripe down the inside of the right wrist was deepening from red to the dull purple-brown of a true burn. They would scar. She knew enough of kitchen injuries to know that. The skin would not come back smooth. Whatever she was, whatever she might yet be in the years she had not yet lived, she would carry the morning's reception on her 2 hands for the rest of her life. She found that she could look at this fact without flinching. Below her, far below, in a room she would never enter again, 20 guests were taking their refreshment in the green room of Ashfern Hall, and a tall man with gray eyes and a thin scar above his right brow was holding a small painted Wedgwood cup at the level of his knee and looking at a panel of wainscoting, and a young woman in white muslin, with a peacock blue sash, was laughing softly at something the Dowager Lady Northam had at last consented to say. Eleanor reached into the bag and drew out, from its inner pocket, the 4 small scraps of paper she had carried in the pocket of her apron for 7 months. She unfolded them upon her knee. The handwriting on each was her own. They were 4 verses, copied in a hand-grown steadier over the years, from books that had not belonged to her. She read them through once, slowly, beneath the cold square of the window. Then she folded them again and laid them flat upon the lid of the chest and reached for the first of the 4 gray gowns. The latch of the door behind her lifted. She did not turn at once. She thought it would be Mrs. Whitlock, come at last with a quiet voice and a folded paper of wages, and she did not wish to look up at the housekeeper's face until she had set her own. She kept her hands upon the folded wool of the gown, and she said, evenly, to the small square window above the bed, "I am leaving by the kitchen door before the luncheon bell. You will not need to ask it of me." There was no answer. The door did not close. Beyond it, along the corridor of the attic floor, came no footstep at all, only the slow, steady breathing of someone who had climbed the 4 flights of the service stair too quickly and was now standing on the threshold of a room he had never in 7 months entered, with his hand still upon the lifted latch, unable to come in and unable to go away. Eleanor turned her head. Julian stood inside the threshold of the green room, one hand still on the brass handle, the other curled at his side, as if it held something invisible and breakable. He had not crossed. He had not spoken since she rose from the floor. The candle behind him guttered once and then steadied. "You will not leave by the kitchen door," he said. Eleanor pressed the bundled cloth tighter against the back of her hand. The blisters underneath had begun to weep through the linen. "It is the only door that opens for me, Milord." "Then I shall open another." He stepped in and closed the door behind him with a quiet, deliberate click that sounded louder than any slam. The lock turned. He set the bronze key on the writing desk, as he had set it 3 months before in another room, on another night, and the small ringing of metal on wood seemed to settle something in him. "Sit," he said. She did not sit. She had spent 7 months not sitting in rooms like this, and her body did not yet remember how. He did not insist. He crossed instead to the side table, where the housekeeper had earlier laid out fresh linen and a basin, and he poured cold water from the ewer with a steady hand. He carried the basin to her. He knelt. "Milord, give me your hands." "Milord, I cannot." "Eleanor." It was the first time he had ever spoken her Christian name aloud, and it traveled through the room with no ornament whatsoever. She gave him her hands. He unwrapped the linen slowly. The blisters along the knuckles had risen in a pale, even row, and the skin between them had already begun to redden in a wider patch the shape of a careless wrist. He looked at it for a long moment. He did not speak. He lowered her fingers into the basin. The cold bit. She did not flinch. She had learned, in 7 months, not to flinch where it might be seen. "How long," he said, "has she been doing things of this kind?" "Since the first afternoon, Milord." "And you said nothing. To whom would I have said it?" He bowed his head over the basin. The candle on the desk caught the thin, pale line of the scar that cut his right brow. When he lifted his face again, his mouth had set into a shape she had not yet seen on him, a shape colder than the one he had worn at the dinner the night before. "Stay here," he said. "Do not move from this room. If anyone knocks, you will not answer. If the housekeeper comes, you will tell her I have given orders. I will return within the hour." "Where are you going, Milord?" He rose. He took up the bronze key. "To the library," he said. "To send for Mr. Blackwood." Mr. Edmund Blackwood arrived from the village inn on horseback within 40 minutes, his boots spattered with the last of the morning's frost, his leather case wedged under one arm. He was shown directly to the library, and the door was shut behind him. Mrs. Whitlock stood guard in the corridor outside with the molasses-slow patience of a woman who had served 3 earls in succession and had learned which silences to keep. Inside, Julian stood by the window with both hands flat upon the sill. "The clause," he said, without turning. "You drafted it." "I drafted it, my lord, 11 weeks ago, at your instruction." "Read it to me again, aloud. I wish to hear every word." Blackwood opened the case. He set the document upon the writing desk and arranged his small steel spectacles. He read in the calm, even tone of a man who had read worse contracts in worse rooms. The clause provided for the dissolution of the marriage contract between the houses of Ashfern and Holbrook, at the sole election of the Earl, without forfeiture of estate, without penalty of dowry recovery, without obligation of public explanation. The price of that election was named in the next paragraph. The Earl would withdraw from the parliamentary seat the Duke of Holbrook had promised him. The Earl would lose the Holbrook backing in the northern counties. The Earl would, in plain terms, lose the political future for which his father had bargained the family name. £80,000 in dowry, Julian said. Forfeit, my lord. The clause states that the sum is not recoverable by either party in event of withdrawal. And the seat. Lost, my lord. And Holbrook himself. An enemy, my lord, a loud one, for a generation at least. Julian turned from the window. The gray winter light fell across half his face. Have the document witnessed and ready, he said. I shall sign it at the long table in the green room, before the company, after luncheon. I wish 20 people in that room. I wish Holbrook seated. I wish his daughter standing. My lord, may I speak plainly? You always have. This will not pass without consequence. Lady Cecilia will return to London with a story she will be at liberty to shape. The clubs will hear of it within the week. There are men in your father's circle who will not forgive it. I know what I am paying. And the maid, my lord? Julian was silent for the space of one long breath. She is not a maid, he said. She has never been a maid. She is the only creature in this house who has ever looked at me without first weighing what I might be worth. I will not have her sold to pay for a seat in a chamber I have never wished to keep. Blackwood closed the case. Then, I shall be ready, my lord. At 2 o'clock. At 2 o'clock. The luncheon bell rang at 1. 20 guests took their places in the long dining room. Cecilia wore the muslin embroidered in silver thread, the peacock sash, the 3 strands of pearls. She laughed at something the Marchioness said, and laid her gloved hand briefly upon the Duke of Holbrook's sleeve, as if to remind the table whose daughter she was. Holbrook smiled the smile of a man who had already counted his winnings. Julian sat at the head. He did not eat. He drank 1 glass of claret slowly and set it down, and from time to time he glanced toward the corridor that led to the green room, and his face gave nothing away. At 1:45 he rose. I beg the company's indulgence, he said. There is a small matter of business which must be concluded in the green room before the afternoon. I should be obliged if you would all attend me. It will not take above 10 minutes. There was the soft confusion of chairs pushed back. Cecilia tilted her head and smiled brightly, as one smiles at a fond eccentricity of one's husband-to-be. The Duke of Holbrook tapped his ebony cane against the parquet and rose without haste. They filed into the green room 2 by 2. The fire had been built up. The long table had been drawn into the center. Mr. Blackwood stood at its far end, the leather case open, the contract laid out in 2 halves, and Eleanor stood by the window in her gray wool dress and white apron, her bandaged hands folded before her face composed in the still, careful way of a servant who has been told to remain and does not know why. A small ripple ran through the company at the sight of her. Cecilia's smile did not move. It simply ceased to mean anything. Julian walked to the head of the table. My friends, he said, Lord Holbrook, Lady Cecilia, I shall be brief, because I have already been a coward for too long, and brevity is the least apology I can offer. The room went perfectly still. 11 weeks ago, I instructed Mr. Blackwood to draft a clause of dissolution in the marriage contract between this house and the house of Holbrook. He drafted it well. I signed nothing then, because I lacked the courage to sign it in daylight, before witnesses, in a room where the lady I was meant to marry could see my hand move. Cecilia's fan stopped. This morning, Julian said, in this very room, in the presence of this company, a kettle of boiling water was tipped upon the hands of a young woman who is under my roof and under my protection. The tipping was not accidental. I will not pretend that it was. I have spent 7 months pretending things in this house, and I have done with it. Holbrook's cane struck the parquet once, sharply. My Lord Ashfern, this is not a matter for the drawing room. It is precisely a matter for the drawing room, Your Grace. It was committed in a drawing room. It shall be answered in one. He turned to Blackwood. The clause, if you please. Blackwood lifted the document. He read the operative paragraph in the same calm voice he had used in the library. He read the forfeiture of the £80,000. He read the surrender of the parliamentary seat. He read the loss of Holbrook patronage in the northern counties. He read each clause as if it were the price of a fair good honestly bought. When he had finished, he set the paper before Julian and offered him the pen. Julian did not take the pen at once. He took, instead, the unsigned half of the original contract, the great folded sheet bearing the seals of 2 houses, the names of 2 families, the figure of £80,000 written in copperplate across the top, and he lifted it in both hands before the company. He tore it in 2. The sound of it was very small, a sheet of paper, tearing, and yet the room moved as if a window had blown in. He tore the halves again. He laid the 4 pieces upon the table. "I would rather lose Parliament," he said, "and I would rather lose Holbrook, and I would rather lose every acre that depends upon either, than spend one more morning under a roof where she may be hurt and called clumsy for bleeding." He took the pen. He signed the dissolution. Blackwood signed beneath him as witness. Mrs. Whitlock, summoned from the corridor, signed as second witness with a hand that did not tremble, though her eyes were very bright. Cecilia found her voice. "You will be ruined. I am aware. My father will see to it that no door in London opens to you. I have very little interest in London doors, my lady. You are throwing away your name for a servant." Julian set down the pen. He looked at her with the cold, grey, level look that had once frightened a kitchen maid on a stairway in a storm, and which now frightened a duke's daughter in a drawing-room in winter. "I am not throwing away my name," he said. "I am, perhaps for the first time in my life, spending it." The Duke of Holbrook rose. His face had gone the color of old wine. "My carriage," he said, "to no one and to everyone, at once." "It is being brought round, your grace," said Mrs. Whitlock, who had foreseen this also. Holbrook took his daughter by the elbow. Cecilia did not look at Julian as she passed. She looked, instead, at Eleanor, and for one instant the porcelain face cracked into something raw and very young, and then it closed again, and the peacock sash swept past the long table and was gone. The guests followed in a slow, embarrassed tide. By 3 o'clock the gravel sweep was empty of carriages. By 4 o'clock the news had begun, by way of grooms and footmen and one indiscreet lady's maid, to ride south toward London, on the same road the Holbrook carriages had taken. 3 weeks passed. The letters from town arrived in batches, and Julian read them at his desk without expression, and dropped most of them, unanswered, into the fire. 2 clubs struck his name from their books. A cousin in the Commons wrote at length and was not replied to. A bishop wrote briefly and was. The northern tenants, having lived under 3 Ashburns and judged the present one the least unjust of them, wrote nothing at all, and went on paying their rents. In the servants' hall, Mrs. Whitlock reorganized the rota. Eleanor was moved out of the kitchen rota and into the library, where she was to assist the master with the cataloguing of the late Earl's books, an occupation for which, Mrs. Whitlock observed dryly, a young woman who carried 4 lines of verse in her apron pocket was perhaps better suited than to the scrubbing of grates. The grey wool dress was put away in a press. A modest gown of dark blue merino was made up for her by the village seamstress. Her hands healed. The new skin came in pale and a little shining across the knuckles, and Julian, passing her in a corridor, would sometimes lift one of those hands without a word, and look at it, and set it down again, and walk on. On the 3rd Thursday after the dissolution, the winter ball that Ashfern Hall had not held in 11 years was held. Lanterns were strung in the long gallery. The chandeliers were lowered and cleaned and raised again full of new candles. Fiddlers came from Newcastle. The neighboring gentry came in such numbers as had not been seen in the county since the old Earl's funeral, drawn by a curiosity that was half scandal and half something else they could not yet name. They were received with the courtesy due to guests and given no further satisfaction. At 9 o'clock the doors of the gallery were opened. Eleanor stood at the head of the great staircase. She wore the sapphire silk. The high waist sat just beneath her breast. The short sleeves puffed soft at her shoulders. The modest rounded neckline framed by the cameo at her throat. The long cream satin gloves reached above her elbows. Her dark hair had been brushed out of its tight coil and dressed in loose waves caught back with ribbons of blue satin, and the candlelight from the chandelier below moved upon it as it had once moved upon the rain on a window. The fiddlers, who had not been told, began to play and then faltered, and then began again. Julian stood at the foot of the stair in evening black, the cravat plain, the scar at his brow catching the light. He did not look at the company. He watched her descend. When she reached the last step, he offered his hand. She laid hers in it. He turned the hand over with the same care he had used over a basin of cold water 3 weeks before, and he drew the long cream glove down from her wrist with deliberate slowness, finger by finger, until the pale, shining skin across her knuckles was bare to the room. A small intake of breath ran along the gallery. He lifted her bared hand. He bent his head. He set his mouth against the scar across her knuckles and held it there for a long moment, in the sight of every guest in the county. Then he straightened, and he did not let go of her hand, and he turned to the fiddlers. "A waltz," he said. They played a waltz. He drew her into the center of the floor. The other couples, after a stunned half-beat, came in behind them. The candles burned high. The sapphire silk turned. Mrs. Whitlock, at the gallery door with her 30 keys at her belt, allowed herself for the first time in 7 months the small luxury of a smile. In the turning, he bent his head to her ear. "What did you write?" he said. "Those 4 lines, in the pocket of your apron, on the morning you lit my fire." "I did not write them, Milord. I only carried them." "Whose were they?" "A poet's. He wrote that to be truly seen by one soul is the only inheritance worth the keeping." "Then you have inherited me, Eleanor Hart." She did not answer in words. She only tightened very slightly the bare hand in his. The waltz turned them once more beneath the chandelier. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall against the long windows of the gallery, white and slow and unhurried, settling upon a house that had at last opened the right door to the right room. And in the pocket of a sapphire silk gown, where once 4 lines of borrowed verse had hidden under coarse wool, there was now nothing at all, for the woman who wore it had no further need to carry, in secret, the proof that she had ever been truly seen. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever stood in a room where everyone looked past you, like Eleanor in her gray wool dress, and wondered if anyone truly saw the person beneath the uniform? Have you ever been burned by someone's deliberate cruelty, the way boiling water fell upon her hands, and made yourself small instead of speaking? And if a man of rank had torn a contract worth £80,000 in front of 20 witnesses to defend you, would you have believed, at last, that you were worth choosing? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, justice, and true love that arrives against all odds, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel.